Thank you for agreeing to be a Portrait of a Graduate Presentations of Learning volunteer panelist this year at Irving Middle School. My name is Lee Arscott, and I am the assessment coach at Irving Middle School. By way of introduction, we did have last year about 90 students from one teacher's class at Irving Middle School presenting portfolios of evidence that they were using Portrait of a Graduate, or as we say, POG, skills in class. But this year we've expanded to 200 students from 6 teachers' classes, and they're presenting POG presentations of learning, or POLs, to show and reflect upon their POG growth. So what is this POG, Portrait of a Graduate? Well, in 2014, the FCPS School Board developed and adopted the Portrait of a Graduate in collaboration with a variety of stakeholders. This adoption of POG acknowledges that in our rapidly changing world, education needs to evolve to fulfill our mission of supporting student success in school and in life. Portrait of a Graduate prioritizes the development of skills that will empower students to be productive citizens of a global community and successful in the workforce of the future. So, to do a quick rundown, there are 5 POG attributes for what our students are and will be. Those are communicator, collaborator, ethical and global citizen, creative and critical thinker, and goal-directed and resilient individual. Under each of these POG attributes, there are skills, with about 26 POG skills total to describe what our students must do to be those things. So there's a lot of skills, which are then further broken down into sub-skills by grade level and so on. So we obviously had to choose a focus. So at Irving Middle School, we decided to focus on 2 attributes and 5 skills. So I won't get into these specific skills right now, though you can see them there, but we are looking at communicator and creative and critical thinker. So in their presentation of learning, students must demonstrate their growth of these 2 POG attributes by reasoning with evidence and reflecting to form conclusions. So what does that mean? There are basically 3 things you'll be looking for. One is that the student provides a collection of artifacts to support a claim of using POG and/or growth of POG. The student explains their evidence and uses it to justify their claim of growth of POG. And the student reflects on POG and/or their growth on POG. So let's break that down. The first one is telling you that the student has to provide a collection of artifacts. So think of this as a portfolio of evidence, and that will support their claim that they're either simply using POG skills or that they're actually growing and developing as a portrait of a graduate. Many artifacts will be digitally presented, probably the most, embedded within a student's Google site. Some artifacts may actually be on paper. The artifacts can be final projects, though honestly it's often more informative to see their rough drafts, their peer feedback, brainstorming documents, outlines, and notes from their research. Ideally, the artifacts will show both how students use specific POG skills and how they grew or developed their use of their POG skills this school year. Then the student must explain their evidence to you and use it to justify their claim that they have grown as a portrait of a graduate. They must explain how their chosen artifacts exemplify specific skills and how they've demonstrated growth over time, specifically this school year. And ideally, their explanation and justification will go beyond that simple recall of buzzwords and show truly deep thinking. Finally, they will reflect on Portrait of a Graduate and/or their growth. They should discuss the value of using and developing POG skills and attributes generally, or better yet, personally. Students should identify moments in time that led to POG growth, and ideally will discuss the impact that feedback and revision had on their learning. And students should identify their next steps in POG growth, or the process of developing in POG over time. So each student will receive 2 scores on a scoring rubric, one for communicator and one for creative and critical thinker. For communicator, a student may score proficient, while for creative and critical thinker, they may score developing. That is perfectly normal to score differently on each of the 2 attributes. We expect most students to score in the middle, either developing or proficient. A few may score below, emerging, or above, advanced. So let's talk about some logistics. We'll come back to that scoring rubric in a bit to explore the look-fors at each score level, but first let's just get a better sense of what these POG polls will look like. So there's a pretty tight schedule to keep to. We need to keep this at 20 minutes per student total in order to accomplish all of these within our given time frame. So it's about 14 minutes for students to present both of their attributes and respond to your questions, followed by 5 minutes for you to discuss and score with your volunteer partner and give immediate feedback to the student right then and there. It's okay if students don't initially fill that first 4 minutes talking about each attribute, like communicator or critical thinker. That just gives you more time to ask them prompting, clarifying, and probing questions. When you go to the scoring and feedback phase, each panelist will serve with 1 or 2 other panelists. You will discuss and come to a consensus on each student's final scores, and you'll mark that same final score on both copies of the rubric. So 1 copy can go directly to the student right then and there, and 1 copy is retained in our records for the teacher. Discuss where you think the student should score out loud. Listening to that little debate is super informative for the student. While you provide that immediate feedback to each student, 2 or 3 others will be watching, listening, and learning from their peers' experience too. So let's go back to the rubric. How do I know how to score each student? What am I actually looking for? So remember, there are basically 3 things you'll be looking for. And I'm going to zip through this very fast. And I encourage you, when you have time to sit down and read and really process this rubric, to go and do that so you don't feel overwhelmed when you walk in on the day for actual scoring purposes. So let's look at the first one, the idea that students are providing a collection of artifacts. If the artifacts show that the student used POG skills, that's developing. If the artifacts also show that the student has grown, improved, or refined their use of POG skills, that is the difference that pushes them to proficient. And remember, we expect most students to score in this middle range. So below that on the rubric, you will see specific look-fors, and to help guide you in your scoring, but really it's that criterion at the top that matters most. So if you see that there are multiple artifacts that reveal growth over time and are specific, you'd lean towards proficient. But for example, if you see they only have 1 content area represented, then you might lean towards developing. And then to flesh this out, emerging is if the students have no artifacts related to POG skills. But to be advanced, that collection of artifacts must be thorough. To guide you in what does thorough mean, you can look at those look-fors. In this case, it would be basically the same as proficient, but more thorough and from multiple subject areas, not just 1 class. So if you have time, I recommend you watch this 2-minute clip on your own, and you'll see an example of a developing collection of artifacts. The second criterion was about their explanation and justification. If the student can basically explain how the artifacts exemplify their use of POG skills, that's developing. If they use their artifacts to prove to you successfully how they've grown over time in using those POG skills, that's the difference that makes them proficient. You'll notice a difference in the look-fors. In emerging, the students really struggle to explain how their artifacts connect. But if the student can show truly deep thinking and speak to seeking feedback to improve, that's advanced. And you'll see that reflected in the look-fors. Again, this is another quick video that I do recommend you watch to see an example of a proficient justification. The third criterion is their reflection. If the student can speak in generals about the value of POG and POG growth, that's developing. If the student can explain why POG growth is important to them personally, when they grew specifically, and/or some realistic next steps, that's proficient. And you probably want to see most of those look-fors to score the student as proficient, but you don't need to check all 4. Emerging students really struggle with reflection. To be advanced requires really deep and mature thinking, and you'll have some guiding look-fors to help you. Here's another short clip I recommend you watch later. And another one to counter that developing example with an advanced example. So the whole rubric, there it is. I waited to the last minute to show you because it looks overwhelming at first. If you want to see what a scoring and feedback session looks like, this is a good clip that you can watch of myself and Miss Nichols scoring a student. And you'll note if you watch this whole video that she scored as communicator developing, but for creative and critical thinker advanced. So it's interesting to see that difference. And if you wanted to see Grace's whole presentation, you can actually watch the full 20-minute video too. It's heartwarming. So let's talk about what's not on the rubric. Presentation skills are not a part of this rubric, and we're not an emphasis in our classes. At this time, we care only about the content of the presentation. You need not assess or give feedback on things like eye contact, professional dress, volume of speech, confidence, neatness, or visual appeal of the Google site. And keep in mind that the answers to your questions count. It is quite possible that students won't initially present enough information to score well, but will better reveal their thinking in response to your prompting questions. All of that counts. As long as you don't put words in their mouth, that Q&A portion is just as relevant for scoring as their initial presentation. So feel free to really dig it out of them. What kinds of questions should you ask? Anything that might elicit the kind of thinking from the student required to show more of those look-fors. We'll also provide you with a list of sample questions at the start of the day, so you can have that as a reference in case you get stuck. Examples of those questions could be, why did you choose to present this artifact? How do you know it was successful or shows your growth? Can you remember any specific feedback your peers or teachers gave you? How did that impact your work? And as you continue to grow up and mature, why is it important to further develop these skills? It's important to note that you always round down on the rubric. A student must meet all 3 criteria in order to score in the next highest category. Do not round them up if they didn't truly reach the bar on all 3 criteria. And keep in mind, your score does not equal their grade. The scores that you give students on their POG poll do not go into the gradebook. It is important that you give honest feedback to the students and accurately score the quality of their POG poll so that students can learn from and reflect upon their experience. Teachers will be grading aspects of their preparation for POG polls and their written reflections on the experience afterwards, but not the POG polls themselves. Rarely are students given such a safe space to try, and perhaps fail, at something brand new. And this is new to us too. Not only are POG polls new to our students, they're also new to us as a staff. 5 of the 6 teachers participating have never prepared students for student-led conferences like this, and none have prepared students for POG polls with this particular focus or scoring criteria before. So we thank you for giving us such a safe space to try, and perhaps fail, at something brand new too. There are more examples if you want to see. I encourage you to go into the slideshow and watch examples like this full example of one of our students presenting. But really, I just want to say a big thank you so very much for contributing to make our first year of POG polls at Irving Middle School a success. We and our students are so grateful. If you have any questions at all, please reach out to me, Lee Arscott, your assessment coach at Irving Middle School. Thank you again.